It's a lecture that I give in Israel to Israelis for many, many years. I change it from once in a while, but by and large, it's a lecture that just gives some sense to the general Israeli public who are completely ignorant about understanding the economic reality. And we will talk a little bit about why that is the case. I'm not claiming that Israelis are different than the lay person in the US or in other countries. But my claim would be that this lack of understanding of fundamentals in economics has consequences on policy. Of course, one cannot at this point in time avoid mentioning that we are in extremely interesting times. I mean, in the US, you have the elections now, and this is related to a big debate in the US between the two main camps. And this is to some extent similar to what we have in Israel. So we just had our elections a week ago, and I could say that unfortunately, what the so-called right wing in Israel, but I say the so-called because there's nothing connecting what they believe in and the traditional conservative views of respecting markets, freedom, law and order. There's nothing about that. These are just parties that are called right, but nothing beyond the nationalism and socialism, basically. And that's part of the interesting issues that are related to the Israeli economy. So it's really going to be interesting because it's not clear what to those of you are not, I guess all of you follow because you're sitting in Yuval's class. So you do know that Netanyahu is now going to be again the prime minister. With him, the two other groups are the two ultra-Orthodox parties that are in the government to just extract, that they say it openly, to extract as many rents as they can. We'll come back to that point because that's a major issue in the Israeli economy. And the extreme right-wing parties that basically would like to extract money for the settlements and just policies to increase the holdup of the Israeli citizens in the occupied territories. What would be the economic consequences? Well, that depends a lot on how much of their demands Netanyahu would allow them to get and how many of the promises Netanyahu gave before the elections he would really deliver. If he would deliver all his promises, that would be probably a huge negative shock to the Israeli economy because the promises are just non-feasible in terms of the cost. Okay, so let's just see what I have in my slides. And before I continue, I don't know how many of you could read or understand Hebrew, but in Israel, I'm highly involved in the public, I would say, debate, discussion. So I have a blog with a lot of things, but almost everything is Hebrew. I have Facebook with more than 30,000 followers. Again, unfortunately, all of it is in Hebrew. A YouTube channel, again, Hebrew, and a podcast in Hebrew. So if any of you understand Hebrew, you're very welcome. I really love the podcast, but again, for most of you, it's irrelevant. So when we look at the Israeli economy, what we see in the perspective of, 70 years, this graph goes back to 1960, so 62 years of how the Israeli economy starting very low, was a poor economy when it was established in 48, but managed within 70 years to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, although not ranked in the top 10 or top 20, more or less the GDP per capita corrected to purchasing power today. Israel is about number 30 in the world, more or less. It all depends on how we measure things. So looking at the big picture, it seems, yeah, we did very well in Israel. But I have this tendency to look at the dark side of things and to not be happy. And my question is, so, but why not better? I mean, some countries do so much better than the state of Israel. Why are we behind? And I'll claim that if we would have adopted economic policies that are less populist, less and that would be helpful. In terms of the situation in Israel, there's a lot of disinformation. So, for instance, Netanyahu, until recently, claimed that during his 10 years of government before COVID, income per capita in Israel, economic growth in Israel was amazingly great. And Israel was an outlier in economic growth compared to any other OECD country. This isn't the truth. So here, if you see the graph that shows GDP in income per capita of Israel compared to the OECD, you could see that in 2009, the Great Recession, Israel is in good shape, but that's just at the start of the Netanyahu regime. And gradually, the growth in income per capita in Israel declines. And over the 10 years, it's more or less similar to the average, maybe a bit better, but nothing extremely special or unique. The thing is that when Netanyahu says that growth was special, an outlier, he's not really lying, just misleading. Why is that? Because he's looking at aggregate growth, so total GDP. Now, why is that an important issue? In most OECD countries, population growth is very slow. So GDP growth, aggregate and per capita are quite similar. But in Israel, population growth is almost 2% every year. So there's a lot of children in Israel. And that means that if aggregate income grows at the rate of, say, 4%, income per capita only grows at 2%. And when you do the correction, and economic growth is, of course, growth of income per capita, you see that Israel is okay. It's not an outlier in a bad way, but also not in a good way. The interesting thing is that, going back to the debate in Israel, what I find interesting is that many like to criticize Netanyahu. I'm one of them, but I do it based on economic knowledge. Many reporters like to criticize him, but they don't know how. Because they see, okay, he claims economic growth is high. They don't understand that this claim is based on population growth and not really on growth in income per capita. So they make up stories. So not just Netanyahu's side and his supporters make up stories, also those who object Netanyahu make up stories. So one of the favorite stories is, yeah, even if we grow, but the fruits of economic growth do not trickle down to all the groups of income in the population. And over the years of Netanyahu, the poor became poorer, the high-tech, workers in the high-tech became rich. So that's the top decile of income earners. They became very rich, but the rest are not in great shape. The middle income group their purchasing power is declining, and social budgets are declining. But all of these claims are just inconsistent with the facts. I'll just show you one figure. Oh, I don't have it here. Anyway, no, so believe me, and you could check me on that. I forgot to copy this figure, that in fact, in the last 15 years, to a large extent, based on the reforms Netanyahu himself did 20 years ago as Minister of Finance. So what Netanyahu did, if we go back 20 years or 19 years, actually, the crisis in Israel in 2003, what Netanyahu did as Minister of Finance was to cut down a lot of the government transfers to the poor, in particular, child allowances. And that created a huge incentive to low-income, low-potential earner families to join the labor market. So Israel moved within a short period of time from one of the countries in the OECD with low labor force participation. Large segments of the population did not work at all, to high levels of labor force participation. I think that today, when it comes to male workers, we are like the average, more or less. Female, okay, that depends which group. Jewish, non-religious, non-ultra-Orthodox women participate in the labor force more than most women in other countries. Arab women do not. Ultra-Orthodox women in a growing rate. And part of a large extent, this increase is a result of Netanyahu's 2003 cuts in transfers. Now, of course, when less money is given to the poor, that increases inequality. But when the poor start working and earn income, that reduces inequality. And when we look at the decade of Netanyahu before COVID, we actually see a huge decline in income inequality. The lowest earners, the lowest decile group income grew up by, in real purchasing power, by more than 60%, whereas the top, by, if I remember correctly, is less than 40%. So you could really see that the fruits of economic growth come to all layers of society. But many people just ignore the facts and say that things are just horrible. And what my claim is that we better have any debate, first of all, based on the facts and not various imaginations people have. Okay, so what's going on in the debate? I think that we have the politicians, those who make decisions, and we have the public. And when the public is uninformed because of politicians, because of journalists that or have their agenda, but in most cases are just lazy, they need to produce a lot of columns and they need to do interpretation, they don't have time to consult, they just write whatever comes to mind, what they think is correct. And then the Israeli public gets really the wrong information. And in particular, this wrong information leads to demands that are actually bad for the Israeli public. But when a politician wants to survive, they have to follow what their voters want from them. So I'll give you an example. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is
of course.
The public debate about the economy in Israel, is it less informed relative, let's say, to the British debate in the UK? Or is it the same level of ignorance? Or is it something special to Israel or similar level to ignorance in the UK and the US?
It's hard for me to say. My guess is that it's a bit worse in Israel because it's hard to point to even a single newspaper that is really doing a good job, not to mention TV shows where the masses watch. But again, in the UK, yeah, you have the Financial Times, but how many people read it? I don't know. So I don't know. I don't know, Yuval. I just know that it's really bad in Israel. And, and yeah, I'm sure it's bad in all countries, but yeah, it's hard for me to compare. Yeah, everyone, guys, just don't hesitate to ask. I could open the chat box, but it's really better if you just ask me. So there's a question here. Do the majority of Israelis want Netanyahu, Lapid, or Bibi? Well, it seems that the majority want Netanyahu, which is really quite amazing to me, but that's the fact. The majority prefer Netanyahu. Is it because they like Netanyahu? Is it because they think that Netanyahu, like if you take the ultra-Orthodox, they will just get more from him? Bad in what terms? Okay, so there is many issues that are not economics, at least not directly. The main thing would be that him and his partners have a very strong interest to destroy the gentle balance of power between government and the court system, the legal system. So they want to pass some laws that just do not exist in any democracy, to give much more power to the parliament and reduce significantly the power of the Supreme Court. Now, Israel doesn't have a constitution, which means that the plan they have, it's still not clear what exactly they would do, is that the Supreme Court cannot rule that any decision of the parliament is illegal in the sense that it goes against the constitution, because we don't have a constitution. So that means that a majority of 61, the parliament in Israel, the Knesset is 120, that means that a majority of 61 could basically decide whatever they want. Theoretically speaking, they could vote in favor of no more elections. I don't think it will come to that, but that's definitely a theoretical possibility. So I think that there are many issues with the ultra-Orthodox and equality that the Supreme Court just says, look, according to some basic laws in Israel, we have some basic laws, but not a constitution. Ultra-Orthodox cannot legally be discriminated in favor, which means discriminating against others. And they want, of course, to have allowed the parliament to cancel that. So many examples of this type. The other thing why I think Netanyahu is bad is, so it's not just, it's everything that has to do with the occupied territories. Now, in the past, Netanyahu was the one that prevented any annexation. But I think that now this elections, there's no one with him to balance him, and it might be a dangerous situation in the occupied territories. As it is today already, the situation is grim. There's a lot of violence there. I mean, there's terror of Palestinians against Israelis, but there's a lot of terror also from Israelis settlers against Palestinians. It's on a daily basis. There's violence of Israeli settlers against Palestinians, and the military, mainly young people in Israel, support the so-called right wing, and these are the same people who are in the military and supposed to protect the Palestinians, and that doesn't happen enough. So there's many issues there. But then, of course, the economics. Netanyahu has I think it goes back to 2003 when he did have the guts to do the right thing. He was punished in the following elections. So the Likud, which now has more than 30 seats, after the 2003 changes, Netanyahu heading the Likud had only 12 or 13 seats in the parliament, which is extremely low. He was punished by his voters for doing these right economic reforms. So since then, he's very careful not to reform anything. Let me add to that we're now with an alternative government, which is not great, the government. It's a weird combination of extreme left socialist parties with some parties on the right, true right, like really believing in capitalism and national right. But this combination somehow allowed them, nevertheless, to do a lot of good things to the economy, reduce bureaucracy that was unneeded, simplify regulation, allow imports to Israel that were not allowed before. And they were very effective in a few ways to reduce the cost of living. Also, they managed, the Minister of Finance, Lieberman, managed the budget in a very responsible way. So unlike the exiting government of Netanyahu, which had a huge deficit, although part of it it was COVID. Part of it was just throwing money at the public before the election. And then Lieberman just, cut down a lot of the spending and behaved in a responsible way. One should remember, I guess you all understand it, but I'll say it nevertheless. A deficit means future taxes. There's no way out of it. So a government cannot be generous by giving people more money without taxing. It just means we will tax you in the future. That's all. Let's see, what else do we have here? Interesting. Well, I didn't know. Thank you. Do you think Netanyahu's coalition with the ultra-Orthodox is a move that gains political influence at the expense of the economy? Yes, of course. Yeah. So let me say about the ultra-Orthodox. I think to some extent there is even a conflict of interest within the ultra-Orthodox community. Most ultra-Orthodox people don't want to be poor, but they are pushed by their leaders not to study core studying. Like they in elementary school, they get a little bit math and then they just focus on biblical studies. So that could be very interesting and very important perhaps, but the return in the labor market for biblical studies is zero, exactly zero. So they finish high school and they don't know basic math, they cannot speak English, of course, nothing in sciences, and they cannot work in a decent job that pays well because they are ignorant. And in that sense, it's a strong interest of the Israeli taxpayer that they that they study more. And now remember, public schools in Israel are financed publicly, including the ultra-Orthodox, and Netanyahu is going to they promised already, the ultra-Orthodox to make it worse, to reduce completely any economic pressure that the ultra-Orthodox kids go and do a core studying. And then there is a question, what were the right economic reforms in 2003? Mainly, this was cuts in government transfers to the poor, conditioned on tax that encouraged, transfers that encouraged high fertility rates and avoiding labor force participation. And this was very important. Ironically, during COVID, Netanyahu and his Minister of Finance promised people, don't stop, you could stop working, we'll pay your salaries. And only Lieberman stopped it. And then we actually saw a huge increase in labor force participation once the Netanyahu government was out. And again, they were just buying votes towards the election. Ultra-Orthodox, what do they work? So they cannot, it's very hard for them to get good jobs that are based on education. All right, so I wanted to give you an example of how misleading the Israeli public in some very basic things has an effect on policy. I think the most basic thing is really the understanding that the government cannot be generous. The government has money to spend that comes from the public. So it's not spending more, is not being generous. Reducing taxes is not being generous. Just everything of all these actions create a deficit and are on the account of the population. But it's surprising how only few people understand it. And then when Netanyahu, but not just him, this is a coalition from wall to wall almost. Clearly the leftist parties, but also Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox, let's expand public education from the age, now it's free from the age of 3. Let's do it from the age of 0. So now the government, Netanyahu clearly promised that once he's back to power, anyone could get basically free babysitting from the government from the age of 0. You see, a lot of people are happy about that because finally, it's a huge cost to send our kids to nurseries. So we're really grateful that we're going to get that for free from the government. But you ask them, but wait, how many children, if you're talking not about religious people, but the average among the non-religious in Israel is about 2 children per woman. That's how we count fertility, per woman. So a typical family would have 2 children on average. Some would have more, but some women do not give birth at all. So that's the average. So, okay, do the maths. Remember, you will get for your 2 children free from 0 to age of 3. But you suppose that you're secular, and you work, so you make, you're in the middle class, you pay taxes. Who would benefit from it? Families that are poor and have 6, 7, 8, 10 children. So basically, there's no way that a family with low fertility would gain in the long run from this policy. And I'm not even talking about the quality that is definitely going to be bad. There's just not any way that the state of Israel could provide free babysitting from the age of 0 to 3 in a high quality with well-trained babysitters or teachers. No way. But you see, people are happy about that. I could give you, and then that encourages politicians like Netanyahu, but many others, to say, yeah, we will do it. Why? Because that's what you guys want. I mean, you think Netanyahu doesn't understand what I just explained to you? Of course he does. He's not an idiot. Some do not understand, but Netanyahu definitely does. And I'll give you another example, which I think is really a good one, because there is no debate among economists that rent control is bad. Okay, that's like a fact. There's so many places, including capitalist United States, in which there are rent controls. Manhattan is a famous example, but there are many other places. Of course, in many European countries, rent control. And it's a natural response when you see the cost of renting going up. People say, oh, we should intervene and have rent controls. In fact, it was even the case in Israel that we had rent control, and it ended really, really bad. Because we know that's very, very clear. Again and again, we see exactly the same. There's not a single example of successful rent controls. You could see that even economists that are not, extreme right-wingers, like Paul Krugman, what they write about, you could read what Paul Krugman writes about rent control. Yeah, it's really horrible because it reduces the supply and increases the demand, creates shortages, creates bad maintenance, creates a black market, creates bad relationship between landlords and tenants, doesn't solve any problem. So I could continue talking about that endless, but the point is that a lot of Israelis want rent control. Why? Because they're not informed. And many politicians, remember Shelley Yachimowicz, she was the head of the Labor Party, when we had our protests in 2011, there were big demonstrations in Israel. So she said, among other stupid things, she said, well, if rent control is so good in Manhattan, why not in Tel Aviv? But everyone knows that rent control, everyone that checks the fact that rent control in Manhattan is really bad. But sort of gives you the idea. What about ideology? Well, yeah, I'm not saying that politicians do not have ideology. I'm not saying that people do not have ideology, but politicians mainly respond to what their voters want. I'd say something about this debate now in the Israeli public between those who call themselves, let's say, social democrats. So actually, the vast majority identify as social democrats, and only a small group identify as more capitalists, libertarian to some extent. Where does the debate come from? So one might simply say, well, people have different ideologies. What is an ideology? What we care about? What are the things that we think should be the government's goal when it designs policy. Okay, so one person could say, I think that policy should be aimed at reducing poverty, so to help the most poor. Someone else could say, no, I think that that policy should be aimed at the middle class, or reducing inequality, or economic growth, or the environment. So of course, if you want to achieve different goals, one should adopt different policies. Okay, but here is my claim. That's not the debate. That's at all not the reason for the debate. The reason is that the source of the debate is about means, not about goals. So if, for instance, I'll tell you my following. If you ask me, what should be the government's goal in policy? I mean, right, I hope you agree with me that there is no sense talking about policy without agreeing about what we want to achieve with policy, right? Policy is the mean. The question is, what are the goals? Here is what I suggest. The goal of government policy is the welfare of the public, with an emphasis on those who are at the bottom of the income distribution. Does this sound fair to you? What do you guys say? You could nod with your heads, those that have a camera. Sounds fair, right? So you see, when I say that, almost everyone agrees. So if everyone agrees with that, how come no one agrees? Well, no one. All the social democrat camp doesn't agree with what I say, because then comes my policy suggestions. So again, it's a lecture. I just translated the slides from a lecture I do in Israel. So what I do not include here things that are sort of agreed on everyone. I just focus on the issues that are under debate, and even not all the issues. So for instance, so I say the objective, and okay, so here it is what I just said, written perhaps in different words, but you could see it. Welfare with the emphasis on those within the low end of the income distribution. Okay, so first, a free competitive market economy. That's my main approach, which includes free international trade. Far from obvious. You could see in Israel, many in both the so-called right and the so-called left. No, we shouldn't allow for free trade. Free trade kills jobs. We know, as economists, no, that's not true. Free trade destroys the agricultural sector. We know it's not true, but that is the claim. So again, those who call themselves social democrats are against free trade, and a lot of interest groups in Israel join them and explain to the public, like the organization of the industrialists in Israel, they are against free trade. Of course, they don't want competition. Flexible labor market, which means no tenure in the public sector. Again, those who are more in a capitalist approach, they agree with that. Yes, labor markets should be flexible, but those who are in favor of the social democratic model are against firing workers. They think workers should have tenure, clearly in the government sector. My view, and I think that's the facts are quite supportive of that. The tenure has very negative consequences on incentives, on the ability of the government to perform, but also on just redistributive justice, because someone, that is tenure, that means you pay someone a salary even if they don't work. And there are many like that. In the public sector. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that anyone who works in the public sector gets a salary for doing nothing. That's absolutely not the case. We need public employees, and the public sector is crucial and important, but the goal of the public sector should be to serve the public. And in Israel, the goal of the public sector, it seems, is to pay wages to the employees in the public sector on the account of the public. But that would be a point of debate. As you have in the US, private schools, that we call it charter schools, the voucher system, like in Sweden, they have it. The Israeli education system is not great. If you look at many, especially the success of the kids, and I think that a reform is really important. I'll not go into it. Generally, privatization, like trains in Israel are public. All the public transportation is government-owned. It's illegal in Israel for a private firm to suggest any service, even without any subsidy from the government. It's illegal in Israel to compete with the government sector in providing public transportation, and the quality is really bad. Well, surprise, surprise. Generally, I mentioned that. Okay, you see the idea. Yeah, reduce protection of labor strikes. Israel, I wrote about that extensively and I studied the topic. Israel is an outlier in the power of the labor unions, and it's used in a horrible, horrible way. Again, I'll not go into it, but you could see where the debate is. This is a good list of things. Okay, now let's see. Someone asked a question. I understand that objection to free trade is to minimize competition from foreign countries so they can have more gain, but how free trade does not hurt local industry, or how could it be that it doesn't hurt? Okay, I'll get to that point later. I'll get to that point. Okay, I'll talk more about free trade. Now, the point I want to make is the following. So, we have these political leaders that define many, almost, half of the members of parliament. You ask them, what's your view? I'm a social democrat. And then they preach for these policies. Now, when you ask them, but what do you mean by social democrat? Or when you ask the public in Israel, so typically I will not do it with you, but I could, because it's pointless. But when I talk to a group of Israelis, I ask them the following. I ask two questions. I tell them, without thinking, just answer quickly. Then give me a name or the first name that jumps to mind when you hear the word social democracy. And immediately they say the names of politicians in Israel or media, important people in the media that describe themselves as social democrat. And then I ask, okay, and when you hear the word social democracy, which countries do you have in mind? And they immediately say Sweden, Denmark. So generally the Scandinavian countries, Holland, Germany, these are the social democratic countries. So by and large, successful social democratic countries. And then I look at and tell, okay, so let's come back to that list. So the person you say the name, typically it's the same Yechimovich I mentioned before. She's like really recognized in Israel as the #1 social democrat. What does she say? And all her, in her camp, they are against free trade. What do the Swedish and Danish say? They are in favor of free trade. What about flexibility of the labor market? Israeli social democratic approach against flexible labor markets. The Swedish, the Danish are in favor. In fact, in Denmark, they completely canceled tenure in the public sector, excluding professors, lecturers in universities. That's the exception. What about private schools? Again, the Israeli social democrats are very much against private schools with public finance, the voucher system, like charter schools. By the way, the Israeli health system is based exactly on that. These are private providers that get the money, a voucher system from the public, from the government. Very successful. The Israeli health system has many problems, of course, but in international comparison, it's a very good system. It's based on the private sector. The providers are private sector. The government is the body that finances it. What about generally privatization of, but yeah, in Sweden, they have this system. They like the private school system. What about privatization of trains, electricity, and so on, and generally public transport? Again, the Israeli Social Democrats, they claim everything should be monopolized by the government. But in Sweden and in Denmark, they actually privatized a lot of that. And so on and so forth. So all of this is just to tell you that people say, yeah, we're great social democrats. They have no idea what they're talking about. But that ignorance leads to policies that are damaging the Israeli public. Okay, then there is, of course, you know, if you on almost any dimension, Sweden is more capitalistic than the United States, more free markets and on all dimensions. But it has this image as if it's a socialist country. What is a welfare state? A welfare state starts with a high output. You cannot have a welfare state in a poor country. And to produce high output, we need a market economy. How do I know that? Well, because as a matter of fact, there's not a single example in human history of welfare, high welfare, good quality of living that was not based on a market economy. All attempts to provide alternatives completely failed. Okay, all the communist socialist attempts of a centralized economy that is not controlled by markets, by free markets, completely failed. Again, I'm not a libertarian. I'm in favor of governments. I'm in favor of public goods. I'm in favor of the government providing financing, education for everyone, and health for everyone, and infrastructure, and regulates the markets, because without regulation, you also don't have competition. You have monopolies and cartels. But the other extreme of the government owning all the production factors just doesn't work. All right, let's skip that. I could briefly talk about Sweden, but maybe what's our time situation? Maybe I'll also skip that, because I gave you the heart of the story. I think that the funny thing is that, yeah, let's just skip the Sweden story and jump. Okay, so I'll just give you briefly the story. So Sweden from the mid-19th century, and the reason I talk about Sweden is that for many Israelis, but also in the US, some in the Democratic Party, they talk a little bit about, yeah, the social democratic model of Sweden. Sweden was a very market-oriented economy since the middle of the 19th century, and over 100 years, from 1870 to 1970, had growth rates the highest in the world. And you could see here in 1970, income per capita in Sweden is 25% higher than average OECD countries. But then it starts a slowdown. And within 20 years, it loses all its advantage and converges to the average. What was the reason? Well, the main thing was too much of a welfare state. So not the welfare state, but too much of it, extremely high taxes, and the economy goes to this slowdown. But then they reform, and part of the reform is significantly reducing government spending, significantly reducing tax rates, building their government policy without a built-in large deficit, so a pension system that doesn't put the burden on the future generations, and a lot of privatization, schools, transportation, electricity, and so on and so forth. And it was successful. You could see that once the reform was adopted, the Swedish economy returns to high growth rates faster in comparison to the average. But then comes the question, so suppose policy makers listen to me instead of all these populists, and They say, okay, Omer, so let's be Sweden. Could we be Sweden? And unfortunately, we cannot. So this is in Hebrew, but I'll tell you, this is crucial. I'll tell you what is written here. The title is, Could we be Sweden? So I'm talking about Israel, of course. And the answer I have is, no, we cannot. And here is the reason. You see, what's written here is non-ultra-Orthodox Jews. So that's today, the majority of Israelis are Jews that are or religious or not religious, but they are not ultra-Orthodox. And the numbers you see here are shekels, the Israeli currency, and by decile. And the number is, if you look at the right here, the minus 17.730, this is the average. No, I'll go to the other end, the plus 5728. Okay, you see the left-hand side column. This is, if you take a average household, Jewish, non-ultra-Orthodox, at the lower decile of income, how much money do they get from the taxpayer every month in transfers, cash transfers, education, and health, more than the taxes they pay? So that's like the net cost of a family in the lower decile income, Jews, non-ultra-Orthodox, okay? It doesn't include everything. In fact, if you include subsidies of housing and subsidies of public transportation, the number is larger. But that's quite a significant number, 5,000, almost 6,000 shekels per month per family. The cost more than they pay. Of course, at the other end, the upper 10% pay every month more than they get, just taxes, 17, almost 18,000 shekels. Okay, the exchange rate is about 3.5 shekels per dollar. So yeah, that's obviously the case. That's a sort of welfare state story. You have the guys who make a lot of money, pay more than they get, and those who make little money, they get more than they pay. Okay? That's sustainable. That's the situation in every country. 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs. These are the numbers for Arabs. You see, it's very different. Only the top 10% pay more than they get, and all the others get more than they pay. Significant, because the Arabs are 20% of the Israeli population. What is the reason that the Arabs are different than the Jews? Well, many reasons. Part of it, discrimination in the education system. It's the same public system in Israel, but the Arab system is really of extremely low quality. And Arab kids, they grow up at home, they speak Arabic, they don't speak Hebrew. And when they finish high school or drop out of high school, their ability to communicate with Israeli Jewish employers, customers, is limited. They don't speak Hebrew. In fact, even their Arabic is not great, because in Arabic there is a difference between the written Arabic and the spoken Arabic. And their English is bad, their math is bad. They get very bad preparation to go to a university. Of course, many of them do. And in some professions, the Israeli Arabs are extremely well integrated, especially in the medical professions. Half of the pharmacists in Israel are Arabs. 20% of the medical doctors, just like they're sharing the population. But if you look at the high-tech sector, very few of them. So I think there is a lot. I mean, there's obviously a lot of discrimination against Arabs in Israel. They don't have political power. Unfortunately, they typically do not agree to join the government. In fact, it's the Arab party that joined Netanyahu in killing the government we just had, that was much more successful and actually increased by a lot budgets to the Arab population. The main thing is that the Israeli Arabs want to combine to be part of the economy and part of society, but it's with discrimination and a lot of hate between the two groups. It's very hard to do. Arabs are fertility rates among Arabs is equal to fertility rates among Jews, so their fraction of the population doesn't increase over time. Now let's look at Orthodox Jews. You could see the numbers. So at the moment, it's about 12-13% of the Israeli population. An average Orthodox family costs to taxpayer about 8,000, 9,000 shekels every month. And this is just not sustainable. The Jewish Orthodox community grows at a rate of about doubles every 16 years, more or less. So already today in Israel, 25% of children are ultra-Orthodox. Now, if these are children that will not be educated in a way that allows them to join the labor market and make good income, they will also, very few leave the ultra-Orthodox community, not enough to change the demographics. And then so as long as there is a non-Orthodox community that is large and a small ultra-Orthodox community, that could work. But once a quarter or a third of the Israeli population are ultra-Orthodox, unlike the Arabs, they have a lot of political power. They're always part of the government and they have a lot of political power. They are not discriminated against. They manage to get a lot. I'm not saying maybe in the job market, in the private sector, there is some discrimination against them, but by and large, unlike the Arabs, they get bad education because that's what their leaders want for them. Poor education, only biblical studies, and a lot of children. As I say, I think the average is 6 to 7 children per ultra-Orthodox woman, which means that in many households, there are 10, 12 children, and that's just a non-sustainable situation. So I think even if we don't, become Sweden with a very generous welfare state, just provide health and education, the burden on taxpayers is increasing over time, but the taxpayers they're not compensated for it. The money goes to support the ultra-Orthodox, the poor Arabs, also the poor non-Arabs or non-ultra-Orthodox. And the burden on taxpayer, you see now the full picture is a shrinking group of people. What will happen in the future? I don't know. I really don't know. But it's a problem, it's a challenge that is easy to be ignored by politicians, because politicians just think of what will happen in the next year or 2 or 3. They don't think about 10 years. That's not their problem anymore. And that's a significant problem. All right. Now,
have there been any serious attempts to better integrate the ultra-Orthodox Jews or to reform the payments they receive?
There's always, but they have a lot of political power because they're always a crucial part of the right-wing coalition. But also before in 1977, until 1977, the Labor Party was in control, but also the Labor Party always had the ultra-Orthodox as part of the, not always, but had the ultra-Orthodox, and then they always manage to be crucial in any government. So it's very rare that they're not part of the coalition. And there are always attempts, but it just doesn't work. They're very stubborn about it. Part of the problem is also the stupidity of the non-ultra-Orthodox Jews that feel, and I sympathize with the feeling. So I don't know if you know, in Israel, there's mandatory military service. But then but the ultra-Orthodox do not do the service. And the way they are exempt, and that's actually when I mentioned initially this, the reason they want to overrule Supreme Court is exactly about that. Because the government say, okay, if you're ultra-Orthodox, you don't need to go to the military. Supreme Court said, how could that be? That's just, that goes against basic, not the constitutions, but fundamental laws of equality in the burden of security. The trick that was done already in the establishment of the State of Israel, when they were a very small group, was that if someone is ultra-Orthodox and devotes fully his time, it's his, not her, to biblical studies, then they don't need to do. It's like instead of serving in the military, you devote your life to biblical studies. Now, we could have just said, look, let's go to an alternative military service system in which we just let them go. But you see that if they are not allowed, if in order to avoid military, they need to devote their life to biblical studies, they're not allowed to work. Now, what is devote your life? That just means until the age of 22 or 23. So, but it's still 5 years that are quite crucial. So they basically join the job market when they're 22, maybe, without education, without, in really bad shape. But the main crucial thing is the very high fertility rates. Now, one might argue, well, okay, that's religion, according to their religion, they have to bring as many children as God helps them to bring. But that's not the case, because if you look at Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, those who came from European countries, 70 years ago, in the 50s, they had only 3 children per household on average. Okay, it's a cultural change that was supported by the Israeli welfare state. All right, I want to talk to you about free trade and to answer a question that was asked about that. So when I show in Israel, I like to show bananas that I took pictures in the UK, just to show Israelis how cheap bananas are. In the US, you know that bananas cost, I don't know, you have it in pounds, but probably much less than $1 per pound. In Israel, bananas cost twice as much as they cost in the UK, and it varies, the price varies. So I always show my collection of pictures of bananas, but not just bananas, also blueberries, which are extremely expensive in Israel, and others. Why are bananas so expensive in Israel? Well, because they're grown locally and imports are not allowed. Of course, the banana is just an example for what happens when you try to protect the local industry or farming sector by preventing import. Now, one could say, okay, that's sort of an ideological take, because maybe Omer Moav thinks that it's better that everyone could consume cheap bananas. But someone else would say, no, it's better that 1,000 families that make their living from bananas would have a source of livelihood. So that's the trade-off. And if you allow free imports, there'll just be more unemployment, and then you'll have to pay unemployment benefits, and maybe you're worse off. So maybe you should actually prefer to pay a few shekels every month more for expensive bananas, but support the Israeli farming. Same about industry. So Israelis, but not just Israelis, this is common all around the world. There is this commercial, this is Zevi, he won a medal in judo in the Olympics, so he's a famous guy. So they hired him, the labor unions, the industrialists, and the economic office in the government, to tell you, you choose an Israeli product, you create job for Israelis. So these are all these commercials that the government is part of it, to create jobs for Israelis by preferring Israeli products. Part of it is just these commercials to encourage Israelis to prefer local produce, but a large, more significant part, of course, is laws that prevent imports and laws that give priority to local industries when it's government contracts. What is the truth? Well, the truth, the simple truth is, I'll show you. Oh, okay, that's just, let's skip that. You see this figure. That's the Israeli exports and imports in millions of dollars. So on the vertical axis, millions of dollars. I could tell you which is export, which is import, but you see, it doesn't really matter. The two graphs move together, right? So the export is the one that is above here. So in the last 15 years or so, Israel exports more than it imports, but over most of the history of Israel, it actually imports more than it exports. And you could see that the two are highly correlated. That's true not just in Israel, even China, which is well known that it's only exporting and not importing. That's a bit old, but you could see even in China, the laws of economics work and exports and imports move together. Not every year, not exactly, but they, by and large, they move together. What's the story? I mean, even if we don't understand the economic mechanism that creates this co-movement of imports and exports, we see the facts. They move together. So that leads to, oh, that's interesting. So maybe the claim that imports destroy jobs is not right, because if there's more imports, there's also more exports. And that's really the story. So I'll give you an example. In the 90s, so about 30 years ago, Rabin was the prime minister. So in Israel, everything goes against your basic intuition. Market-oriented reforms are actually done by the left government, and peace agreements are done by the right government. So just opposite to the rhetorics. But anyway, under Rabin, they do a huge opening of markets, and a very large segment of the Israeli industry collapses. For instance, textiles, shoes. Now, you're all young, but I remember, in the 90s, I was already in my 30s. And before that, if I wanted to go for a run, I could only buy some locally made, extremely low quality shoes. There's Nike, Adidas, no, that didn't exist in Israel. You wanted to buy a laundry machine, you had to buy a locally made that cost, 4 times more than the equivalent imported. So things were very expensive, but there was, a lot of jobs for locals. But these were bad jobs. These were jobs in sectors that Israel didn't have a comparative advantage and paid minimum wages. And as there were more imports, more dollars were in demand. And when dollars are in demand, right? Because if you want to import, you need dollars. When dollars are in demand, their price goes up. What does it mean the price goes up? The value of the shekel compared to the dollar declines. The shekel becomes weak. And when the shekel is weak, exporting becomes fantastic, more profitable, because the exporter gets more shekels for every dollar. So you see, and then that encouraged exports. You could see in the figure what happened in the 90s. You see within 6-7 years, imports to Israel doubled in their money value, in the dollar value, doubled. But then you could see how exports catch up. Why? Very simple mechanism. The exchange rate changes in a way that the shekel becomes weak, meaning that an export that gets dollars gets more shekels for the dollars and more profits. So more investment in producing goods for export. If not the reform in the 90s, Israel would have not been the very successful high-tech nation it is today. So free imports do not destroy jobs. Well, they do. They destroy inferior jobs and create instead of them better jobs that pay higher salaries. So it's almost win-win. Free trade is almost win-win. The public wins. More consumption of more goods for lower prices. Workers win because there's more employment opportunities. But some people lose. The banana growers lose, okay? The local industry that produced textile and now went bankrupt lost. Okay, so there's always a small group of people that lose any reform. But if you say, okay, because someone loses, we'll not do a reform, you're just stuck in the history and you don't enjoy all the benefits of free trade and advanced technology and so on and so forth. So let me just stop here and just allow you to ask any questions you might have. Okay, yeah, I see. Okay, someone just wrote, oh, I see the logic. Okay, that's not a question. All right, guys, any questions?
Omer, can I ask one question?
Of course.
So some say that Israel in a special situation, that it should subsidize agriculture due to the defense issues. Perhaps after some sudden war in the next year, there will be a boycott against Israel, and we must subsidize agriculture and sustain a local ability to produce our own food, even if there is an economic cost. What do you think about it?
Yeah, okay. Thanks for the question, Yuval. I'm sure that you know the answer, but thanks for asking anyway. There are two parts for this. One, you could subsidize farming, but there is a way that is more efficient or less efficient to subsidize farming. The efficient way is direct subsidies, and in fact, that exists in the US, and in fact, almost, as far as I know, any OECD country that wants to subsidize its farmers does it directly. You just give the farmers money. How you give them exactly? Well, you could go from different things. If, for instance, you want to see bananas in Israel, so pay them to grow bananas. Okay, after all, we want to be a banana republic, right? But alternatively, you could subsidize indirectly by blocking competition. That's a very inefficient way. So that's my first part. Let's distinguish between subsidizing farming and the way we want to subsidize. So I just take a very strong stand on, be my guest, you could subsidize if you want to, but do it in an efficient way. I'm an economist. I'll not tell you, ideology. You want to grow bananas in Israel, you want whatever. But as an economist, I'm saying, let's achieve the goal in the most efficient way with the least damage to the general public in Israel. The second part is food security. And that's a claim we heard a lot from the farmers recently, because the government that was for a short period of time actually opened some of the markets. And there's like a ritual in Israel every year around the holiday of Passover, there's shortage of eggs. Why shortage of eggs? Because imports of eggs are not allowed, unless with sometimes there is a special permit. And even producing eggs in Israel is not allowed unless you have a special government permission with a quota. So it's fully regulated by the government. People have an egg quota. They could trade the quota. And as a result of that, sometimes there is shortage of eggs. But then what do the farmers say? Look, food security. If you allow imports of eggs, we are not as efficient, or, the climate, whatever. This will destroy the Israeli egg production industry. And then if the world would put an embargo on us and will not allow imports of food, you will not have eggs. Fine. But what do the chicken eat? So from a point of view of an economist, what is a chicken? It's a machine. You put grain on one side, eggs come out on the other side. Where does the grain come from? All of it imported. Israel doesn't produce its food. It produces eggs, it produces milk, it produces some fruit and vegetable, but the staple crops, the food to feed these animals, grains, the food that we consume, the main part of food that makes pasta and bread and rice, not to mention coffee, all of that is imported to Israel. Israel cannot There's a very detailed report of the Ministry of Agriculture, actually, that states clearly Israel cannot produce its own food. We're a large population in a small area of land that is fertile. We cannot produce our food. So we could talk about food security and just, reduce our quality of living, but we cannot really avoid the situation of being hungry if one day the world decides not to send any food to Israel.
Are there any questions to the students here or students at home? We have one question here. Well, perhaps you would come here so Omer could see and hear you.
Going back, is that a campaign choose an Israeli product to give a job for an Israeli? What kind of other globalization economic policy can alleviate any issues towards this?
Yuval, can you please repeat the question for me? I didn't hear well.
When you said choose an Israeli product to give a job for an Israeli, what kind of economic globalization policy can alleviate any issues that come from this campaign?
יובל, אני לא הבנתי מה הוא שואל. בוא תחזור אתה בבקשה על השאלה, אם אתה יכול.
So do you ask which
globalization, like any economic policy about globalization?
which policy
globalization
could implement to increase globalization and that can help Israel? What should be?
Oh, okay. Thank you for the question. Thank you. Yeah, so to me, it's clear that there's small groups with strong economic interests. They're not very rich. They're not very poor. They're actually the wealthy that lose from globalization. The Israeli economy as a whole depends on the world. The growth of the Israeli economy is a result of exporting to the world, and without globalization, we cannot. So that's basically, the government should just reduce regulation that prevents globalization. Okay. I'm also not afraid of more guest workers in Israel. That's typical to many places, the fear that guest workers destroy local jobs, but that's not really the case. That a lot of research shows that. All right, Yuval, I think our time is done, right?
Perhaps a short time for one last final question. So let me ask a question. In the recent years, the public expenditure in Israel as a percentage of GDP has decreased. And some people are concerned about it, in particular, Professor Zeira, who is the author of the textbook. Are you happy or concerned from this decrease in the public expenditure as a percentage of GDP? Well, do you hear me? I think we may have a connectivity issue. Okay, so I think that Omer has been disconnected. So I would like to thank Professor Omer Moav for this excellent talk. Those that in the lecture, please just write your name before you leave. And we will meet again on Tuesday. We will have a hybrid talk.
Yuval, אני חזרתי.
Oh, okay, great. Did you hear my question, Omer?
I think I did. I'm sorry that my computer just, I saw my battery just went flat suddenly.
So we have just 1 minute. Is it good that the public expenditure, the share of GDP in Israel is decreasing, or is it bad?
Yeah, so I had a big debate with Zeira and others on that. And look, when I asked them, when you want to increase government spending, you agree that you should raise taxes. And of course, that's what they say. And I asked them, who would you tax? And they typically try to avoid answering that. Because if you go on world comparison, you could see that, yes, maybe the taxes, maybe. Like if you do it correctly, the calculation Israel is not really below the OECD average. Pensions are private in Israel. In many OECD countries, pensions are part of the budget. Military service is a tax. If you just change the system and you pay soldiers and tax more, whoops, magic, we're above the average. But suppose not. Okay, the claim is we should be like the average. Why? Why aspire to be average? I don't know, but okay, fine. The top earners in Israel pay more taxes than the average OECD. So by all means, you want to be like the average? I'm happy about that. I'm happy to pay less taxes. You want to increase the tax burden on the middle of the population? I feel sorry for them. That's mean. But the main thing is you ignore completely the fact that the welfare state in Israel is not sustainable. Zeira ignores the ultra-Orthodox issue in Israel. He doesn't have an answer to that.
Omer, thank you very much for this excellent talk.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.